Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Press Play Lifestyle Inspired podcast, where we do interviews with inspiring and interesting people like my new friend Dhenu, whose name she will say much better when she introduces herself. And we do this for our listeners to help them find the resources, tools, and support that they need to live their best inspired lives. So, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi, everyone. I'm Dhenu. I'm an immigration lawyer in Chicago, and I'm excited to talk to you all.
I love that you're from Chicago. There's not a lot of us from the Midwest. I'm from Milwaukee, and a lot of
Oh,
our,
really?
yeah, so I'm close to, if I ever need an
Yeah.
immigration lawyer enough, no. But a lot of my guests are like a lot of West Coasters for whatever reason. There's a lot of folks from,
Which is fine. Immigration law is actually what I practice, and that's one of the few practice areas in the legal system that's nationwide because it's a federal practice area. So I actually do have clients from the West Coast.
that's really interesting. I
Yeah.
didn't know that I always thought, I'm ignorant of some of the rules, obviously, but I always
Mm-hmm.
thought that lawyers had to practice in a specific state
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
there's practice areas that are federal level. Is there anything other than immigration that you're aware of that's sort of at that higher
Oh,
level?
federal, yeah, there are lawyers who do like criminal defense, that's federal criminal statutes. There are IP lawyers that are
Oh yeah,
federal.
intellectual property. Okay. Yeah,
Hmm.
that makes sense. I could see how that would be hard to, you wouldn't want to file something in every state, right? That would be ridiculous. Although it wouldn't put
Yeah,
it
so
past.
it's interesting because sometimes lawyers have like even within a practice area, some segments are they're okay to practice federally and some segments are state specific.
Yeah.
Tax is one of those areas that I think is usually federal tax laws, especially the federal income tax laws are, the same regardless of which state, but then you have state income tax and state laws that are separate. So it's kind of interesting, like the legal system isn't totally uniform, but immigration is considered to be one of those areas that's uniformly federal. We do have to sometimes go to court, and when we go to court for deportation defense, it's helpful to have someone who's local because they'll know the judges a little bit more. But then even for those cases, like sometimes if I have a client who used to be in Illinois, but they moved out of state and they want to keep their lawyer, we can represent clients in immigration courts telephonically. We can represent clients,
Wow.
occasionally we would, go there to represent. It's interesting. This has become like its own little, niche within the legal system in terms of how it's practiced.
Yeah, and it seems, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but or maybe I can ask the question. It seems like
Mhm.
it's also very fluid. Like it's one of those things where new people become in the White House, and now you have a new
Mhm.
set of mandates or rules that come down. Is that true, or is it just
Very true.
perceived
That
that way?
it's
Okay.
one of those areas that's very politically sensitive. And there's actually a really good reason for it. Immigration, and this is probably, a little bit more in depth than you were hoping to go, but
Oh
I think
no,
it's good to get
perfect.
this background because immigration law is one of those areas that is directly controlled by the executive branch. So it's not in the judicial branch, in the three branches of the government, but the executive branch, which is interesting because that's why it's so dependent on who the president is
Mhm.
and whose administration and whose immigration policies are we going to be working with. And
Yeah.
so even immigration courts are not independent, and that's actually something that I think it's probably time to make those courts independent just for in the interest of justice. But they are directly under the executive branch. So
Yeah, that's really odd. It's like it's one of those areas that doesn't have kind of the protections of
mhm.
having additional people to go, wait a minute, let's like look at this holistically. Is this what's best for our country versus
Right.
maybe, and it sounds like it's then a lever, right? Because they can't maybe pull other levers, but they can pull that one because they're in
Yeah.
charge of it, right? So they're like, oh, I'm
Directly in
gonna
charge of it. Yeah,
build
absolutely.
a wall, or whatever it is
Yeah.
that they're gonna do. So how does someone end up being interested in immigration law? It seems so specific
Mm.
and complicated. You kind of bit off a pretty big, like that's an elephant. That's one bite at a time. So what kind of got you into immigration law?
It was actually interesting. So I did immigrate to the US when I was about 10 years old, but I was young and I was so lucky I didn't have to go through any of the legal stuff myself. My parents became citizens before I turned 18, and then I got to derive citizenship from them. I didn't even have to take the citizenship test. And so I didn't have to go through some of that difficulty, even though legally, but even though, I did go through the experience of being an immigrant, and having sort of the culture shock and all of that. But one thing that did it kind of took a winding path, to be honest with you, Jackie, because I I found myself interested in the law because one of the experiences that an immigrant has when they immigrate first is this feeling of disempowerment. I don't know my way around this new country. I don't know my way around this system. I don't know what's expected of me in school. You know, is what I was doing correct in this new context? And that disempowerment kind of leads you to seek empowerment. And I couldn't find a field that was more speaking to that quest for empowerment than the law. And, and I've told people this many times before, but the way I kind of understood it in my head is that, if I want to learn and be a master at the game of chess, I need to learn the rules really, really well, right? And the law is the rules of the country. And so it gives you that empowerment that I think sometimes you crave when you're an immigrant. Um, but at the same time, I didn't go straight into immigration law. I went to law school thinking I wanted to do healthcare law because I was really good at science, and because I had, some physicians in my family, and I thought, oh, okay, this seems like a natural fit. But when I got into externships at, like, I did an externship at the American Medical Association and a few other internships, and I realized that it wasn't really working for me because much of healthcare law, even though not all of it, is dealing with insurance companies, dealing with corporate heads, hospitals, and big industries like that. And that wasn't where my heart was. My heart was in working with people, in working with smaller companies, smaller employers, people who directly had an interest in somebody else. And so I gravitated towards immigration law kind of by accident. I had a job right out of law school where I was kind of at a general practice firm, and I did many types of cases, and I found that I had really good tolerance for immigration cases. Now, the reason I say that is because with immigration cases, you don't get immediate results most of the time. A lot of times your cases are going to take years. And so you really do have to have the tolerance to work with government agencies. And we end up working with about 5 government agencies, in certain different government agencies, in different cases, and sometimes several in the same case. And so, it requires a certain level of patience, but also grit to be able to continue to push on and on and on. And I feel like that ended up being a great fit for me because I am someone who's very patient, who's very persistent, and I'll keep pushing and pushing and pushing until I get a result, an answer, etc. So that ended up working out. But it is also a practice area that for some lawyers becomes extremely frustrating, because, it does test you. It tests you.
Yeah. So I have to imagine, with there being so much change, um, is there ever a time where the case is kind of going really well and then the political climate sort of shifts, and now all of that work is essentially, I don't know if it's undone. I don't even know what that means. I'm not sure what I'm asking because I'm not a lawyer in this field, but I mean, can you put in a lot of effort and time and
And
think
then
that you're
have
going
that.
to get a
Yeah.
good outcome?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, it's interesting because there were a couple of cases that come to mind when you ask that question. We were preparing to file an application for somebody who had been married to a citizen. They had entered the US lawfully. So it should have been a straightforward case. Now, apparently, in one of the cases, I know it was possibly the ex-spouse of the US citizen who was really unhappy with her, being remarried. And even like maybe just weeks before we filed, probably complained to ICE or something like that. And we were ready to push out the application, but this person ended up getting arrested by ICE. And that means we had to basically start all over because the process is now different, because now it's defensive and not proactively applying.
Mm, gosh, that's just frustrating. It just sounds like
So,
it's really hard. So I just so and there's a lot of things that I've heard in the news, and since I have never actually talked to a lawyer, my experience with immigration, I think we talked about a little bit before, is like we had au pairs for a while. We have four
mm,
children. One of our children's special needs, and both of us worked full time, and it just wasn't possible. And so we had some of the most amazing women ever in our life, and some of their friends, like one of them fell in love,
mhm,
like deeply crazy adorably in love,
mhm,
and they got married. They were married for a while. She was here on a, it was like a 2-year work visa, like au pair type
mhm,
visa, J1, I want something like that, but anyway.
mhm,
um and then like they were filling the paperwork out like a way ahead of time. They would have been married almost 2 years by the time they did all that. And some of the stuff that they asked was just, I would never ask anybody those questions. Like how is that any, like, I get it, you don't want people to be lying about it, but they went through like an awful lot of work to like 2 years worth of work. I think you almost can give them a pass, but it's just like,
yeah,
holy moly, what kind
yeah.
of people ask that stuff? It's just
It's a very tricky process. And I've had clients who are like, it couldn't have been easier. We flew through this and it was so easy. And if you get lucky, it is really actually feels easy. But then if you are one of those clients where there's even one tiny reason for them to have a question, maybe it was a typo, maybe you've missed an address that you lived in, or, maybe you hesitated before answering a question. Like, so maybe they asked you, where did you go for your first date? But then you weren't sure what counts as a date, because that's actually, sometimes
that's
you don't have a
cultural. Yeah.
date,
Yeah.
Uh, so we've had clients like that where people have become confused, and it's like, okay, that moment of hesitation wasn't because we didn't have a real relationship. It was because, well, you're asking about a date, and I don't know if our like little trip down to McDonald's counts as a date, or if it's when we formally went out, or
And I
um
imagine people are scared too, because it's like you're getting interrogated by people to just, and they get to decide your fate, kind of. And you didn't do any,
yeah,
but you didn't do anything wrong.
yeah.
You're just,
Or like they're asking about dates and you mess up the year, or you mess up the month, you know um it's crazy, sometimes how it can all kind of snowball. And then pretty much before you know it, it's snowballed into like an interview where they've separated the two of you. They're asking you questions, they're comparing your answers. I've had clients that were asked to draw a blueprint of their home. It's interesting, but it's not everyone. So sometimes people hear these stories and they're like, well, but my experience was nothing like this, it was so simple. But then it's because you got lucky.
you were in a good 4-year term at that point. One thing I'm really curious about, of course it probably will make me sad, maybe I shouldn't ask, but it's the there's a lot of kids that get caught up in all of this stuff, right? The
Hmm,
immigration stuff. And
absolutely.
I know specifically with some of the changes in the last few years, there's a lot of news about the impact on children. And
Mm-mm.
so are there different rules, or do the rules just only apply to the parents and the kids sort of are left to what? Like, I don't, how do kids play in all of this legal stuff with
So there
immigration?
are some differences in how, what rules apply to kids versus parents. Like unaccompanied minors, for example, there is a process for them to go through immigration separately if they're unaccompanied. But then what's interesting about immigration law in terms of defensive, and that's what we hear mostly in the news, is the defensive side, right? The defensive immigration is where, we're talking about asylees, refugees, people who are trying to enter the country to seek our help for some reason or another. And defensive immigration law, or immigration law in general, there's no right to an attorney, even if the person who's being asked a question is 6 or 4.
Mm.
They don't have a right to an attorney. And so sometimes that's where you hear those extreme situations where it's like, somebody whose feet don't even touch the floor, and they don't understand anything, and they're being asked, can you tell us, about the persecution in your country? Or,
And they're like, what's
they're like,
that mean? Right.
what's a country?
Yeah. Like, I'm poor. I want some chicken nuggets. Like, what?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, that seems like one of the things that was always so sad for me is just sort of see like parents trying to go somewhere for a better place for their kids, and then like kind of I feel like it's a criminalization of someone who's just trying to find the right, like a right way. And I do hear people say, well, why didn't they just do it as like you were saying, there's defensive and there's offensive, but
Mhm.
they don't know if they knew that. I'm sure they would make an attempt to try it, right? If they thought it would work. But
Or if there was even a path available. I mean,
right.
our immigration system is, I think the most recent like total overhaul was like, it's based on the 60s. And there have been some new rules. Like I think that there were some new like restrictions that were introduced by President Clinton at some point. There was amnesty introduced by President Reagan. That's expired. There's no more amnesty. Um, but it's interesting because, like you said, different presidents have tried different things, but it has become sort of like a road that had, different president fill in different potholes, but it needs to be repaved at
Yeah.
some point, because it's just not a smooth pass, and there's not options available for people who logically somebody might think there should be options available for someone like this, or there should be a pathway away, available for someone in this position, but there isn't. And a good example of that is like if somebody came in as a fiance and then they had a child with them, right? Like, so from a prior relationship or whatever, child was a minor, they came in, but then, the person legalized and they came in legally, they followed all the legal processes, but then at some point, because we all age, the child turns 21. As soon as the child turns 21, he or she is no longer a dependent to their parents. And so all of a sudden, you have people who are illegal overnight just because they turned 21.
And they have no idea. They must. Some of them probably have no idea either. Like it's not like they were like,
So
oh, tomorrow I'm going to be illegal, right? I mean, like, who does that?
yeah, it's bizarre. It's like, well, I did everything right.
Yeah.
There should be a path available, right? Like I shouldn't have to prove something bizarre like I don't intend to live in the country, because that's really what you have to prove if you want to get a student visa, and the person supposedly wants to get that to go to college, but they came with their parents as a child. Like why should they have to prove that they want to go back? That's just, it's
Yeah.
weird.
Yeah.
It's not logical. And so there are some things like that in the law which absolutely confuse anyone who's trying to follow the logic. And for
Yeah. Doesn't make
me,
any
that's
sense. Yeah.
difficult as a practitioner to try and explain to my clients, like, look, I know it's not your fault. I know you tried, but here's what we have to do. Or maybe explaining to them why they need to prove that they need to go back to their home country when they're like, but I moved here when I
Like
was
here's, but this
16,
is
right?
my
Like, why
point.
should I have to go back to my home country,
Yeah.
And it's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole sometimes. And it's because the system hasn't fully been looked at comprehensively. The road has never been repaved since, for
Forever.
years,
Yeah.
years. And our
Oh,
numbers are outdated. I mean, our needs are different now as a country. We're moving in a direction that's, very technologically advanced. We're looking at, in a way, almost a global competition for cutting edge talent. And sometimes we're ahead of the game, but, sometimes we fall behind. And a lot of it has to do with how our policy around immigration has changed.
wow, it's very interesting to me. Like you would think that going into the legal profession, you'd go into that because you want like to know the rules. And
Yeah.
and I would always think, well, and again, naive, well, rules should make sense or
Hmm.
have some sort of logic behind them. But then the way some of it plays out, it sounds like it doesn't feel or seem logical.
Yeah. Maybe it was logical at one time. Like maybe when it was originally created, it made sense for that day, for that time period. But things have changed, and getting immigration laws to change is a ginormous task, and it takes so much political will, that it's difficult for someone to commit to, whether either side of the aisle. It's difficult for politicians who are up for re-election ever so often to commit to something that's going to take this kind of energy and effort and political will.
Yeah, and it sounds like again, since it's controlled by a specific branch too, that like there has to be a reason that they want to do an overhaul, right? Which
Yeah.
is a lot of
Yeah,
that sounds like it's like a big thing to take care of. So
it
how
is.
so what kind of people like I'm sure immigration means a lot of things too. So
Hmm.
who is an ideal client for you or someone that you think that you would have the most ability to help or that you attract a lot of and that's a good client?
Yeah, I do attract a lot of people who are seeking some kind of status based on like a change in relationship, based on marriage, based on divorce, based on also based on like getting employment in the United States. Also, the reverse, I mean, not the reverse, but the other side of the coin being that the employer who wants to hire the employee, um, they're looking for an option available. So those are kinds of ideal clients for me. I do a little bit of defense work and usually it's defense work when somebody comes to me for a proactive application, but like I explained, something happens in the middle of it and it turns from affirmative to defensive. And so I've had to do defense work, and I don't mind it, but it isn't primarily what I seek. I seek a lot of work when it comes to people who are changing their status, who are, who came here maybe initially on a temporary reason, but then they want to stay here permanently because, like your au pair, they met someone, they fell in love. And that's one of the things, I mean, I feel like, not just as a country, but as human beings, we have to celebrate, people falling in love, people, families, people reuniting with families. I mean, um, and I'm glad that that is actually foundational to the immigration system. And so I think that, we have to be protective of those relationships and those bonds, because otherwise, what do we have as human beings? You know?
Yeah, yeah. I love that. That's beautiful. And my friend's name is Alice. She was
Hmm.
from Italy and her husband was originally his family is from Mexico, but he was born in the States. And so they're
Hmm.
the best couple ever. They're still in California now. They're adorable. So
Hmm.
sometimes love wins and everything worked out for them, but it was kind of an interesting trip they went on.
Yeah, and it's a very, for international couples, there's so many layers to it, right? They have families in different countries. So even getting a celebration, an event together, there's so many decisions that have to be made. Where do we get married? When do we travel? If
Well, then
the
there is like every country they're from. Like she said, there's like a dual citizenship thing, which was good because she could stay part of her country and also part of this country. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's just my head's ready to explode. But like
Yeah.
kind of
So different
knowing,
countries have their own rules, which are different. And that also plays into the whole decision making process. And, it's interesting because these cases too, they take sometimes, over a year, and you're thinking, well, what if you want to travel, and when do you travel? And
yeah,
so
they didn't
having
travel because they were scared.
yeah, having someone to guide through that decision making process. I mean, I feel like that's something we love doing because we understand really well what kinds of factors our clients keep facing when it comes to
Mhm.
these things. And it's not just about the legal paperwork. So many of those decisions are not about the actual immigration case, but other decisions connected with when should I have my wedding? When should I bring family here? Should I have my wedding here or in my other country? Whatever. It's interesting.
That is very
Um,
interesting. So how can people find you if they are looking for some support in terms of needing an immigration person to help them in their love?
yeah. Or, like any of the other things, if they're
Or
looking
they're
to
not
hire
loving.
somebody or they're
Yeah.
looking to come here to work for someone, absolutely. They can contact me at my law firm, 312-854-7065. They can always email me. And find my website is www.swagatusa.com. That is spelled SWAGATUSA.com. And my email address, Dhenu, DHENU, at SWAGATUSA.com. Swagat means welcome, by the way. So the
Oh, that's
name actually
beautiful.
means welcome to USA
What is it? Welcome in what language?
in Sanskrit. So in a number of
Yeah,
ancient Indian language.
that's wonderful. A friend of mine is from oh, of course it would go away right now. It's like really he's Tamil,
Hmm.
and he's their language is really pretty. So he's everyone from India seems to speak like 27 languages. He was like his state language, Hindi, English, and then there's another one that he spoke as well. And I thought, oh
Hmm.
wow, that's so beautiful.
Hmm.
But so I will make sure in the show notes though to make sure we have it all written out, so that way if anyone is trying to get a hold of you, they don't have to remember or had the pen to write all of that down. But I really appreciate you taking the time to be on this interview, and I love that you're out there helping people, find a path that
Yeah,
way.
well, I hope that this, gives spark some inspiration in your listeners. And thank you for this wonderful conversation.
You're welcome. I look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you. Take care.